Hi guys and gals. A question that's popped up quite a lot is, should I wait for the 5080 Super or even a 5080 Ti? And I'm going to try and answer that question as best as I can in this video. So I think a lot of this comes out of a lot of disappointment with the lack of generational gain over, for example, the 4080, with gains being typically in the range of 9 to 13, maybe 15%. So more at 4K, less at 1440p, for example. And we didn't see the ray tracing gains that would have been expected either. So in that context, it might be tempting for people, especially with what I would call the bloodbath of a launch, where 5090s were obviously a paper launch and 5080s weren't that much better, to be honest, in terms of availability. So it's in that context that we think about whether waiting possibly a year for a super series, just like happened with the 40 series and earlier generations as well. So let's examine the numbers and see, is this something we should think about, whether we wait or we pull the trigger? And there's a lot of factors at play. Everyone's story will be different about whether they should buy now or later. And I'll offer some scenarios where someone might buy a 5080 right now if they can get one. And I'm sure availability for the 5080 in particular will start picking up over the next 2 or 3 weeks. I'm sure a lot of stuff is on back order as it stands. So I'd be more hopeful on the 5080 than the 5090, which I don't think is going to be in any stock, maybe ever. So I think a lot of people's dreams of owning the absolute Halo product are maybe fanciful, if I'm being unkind. And it may be only people in the know or with connections that might actually get their hands on 5090s ultimately. So we'll see how that goes. I'm not really focused on the 5090 because it's a bit like unobtainium in the Avatar universe. You just can't get your hands on it. It wouldn't matter if you had 3 or 4 grand. You still couldn't get one. Or at least mere mortals couldn't. So let's go through the numbers and see how this pans out. And it might help some people to decide, do I wait now? Do I buy second hand? Do I go for something like a 5080 right now? Do I wait for AMD? Or what will I do? Let's have a look. So the 5080 is based on the GB203 die in the Blackwell series. So the RTX 5080 is the only GPU currently on that. And we should see an RTX 5070 Ti as basically a cut down version of this later. We're going to look at die sizes, okay? So these chips are basically rectangles. When you measure the surface area of 203, you get 378 square millimeters, which is roughly half of the GB202, which is reserved currently for the 5090. And across the board, we see specs that are pretty much exactly half, so that kind of bears that out. To give that comparison between 203 and 202 some historical context, let's look at Ada Lovelace and Ampere, the previous 2 generations. So AD103, which was used for the 4080, is very, very similar in size, 379 square millimeters, and that was 62.2% of AD102, which was the 4090 was based on that. So obviously there is a very significant drop off in comparison between the top tier and the next tier down. If we go back to the previous Ampere generation, the picture is a little bit more complicated because there was a die that was in between what became sort of the 3070 Ti 3070 chip and what ultimately, I suppose, well, to put it another way, there was no plans for any desktop GPUs originally to go on the GA103, which is what I'm talking about here. Okay, so if we look at this, the 3060 Ti ended up on the GA103 die, but the 3070 Ti and 3070 and so on were on the GA104, which doesn't kind of make sense when you think about it. But this came down to supply issues at the time. The GA103 was, as far as I know, something that was designated for 3080 laptops, for example. So it was basically somewhere in between the top tier desktop chips and the next tier down desktop chips. It was actually in between. So the 3080, 3080 Ti, 3090 Ti, and so on, that was GA104, and then you had 3070 Ti, 3070, and so on, being on the GA103 or GA104, sorry, and then the GA103 being that kind of 3080 laptop chip, but also was used later on for the 3060 Ti due to supply issues. Okay, so that's a bit complicated. I won't dwell on that. But what I'm trying to say there is that I'm focusing on the GA104, which is really the next tier down of desktop graphics cards. So when we compare AD103 to AD102, 62.2%, and then when we look at GA104 versus GA102 for Ampere, we're looking at something very similar at 62.4%. So we've gone from what had become fairly typical of something just under 2/3 of the size to something about half the size. Okay, so that explains the massive gap between 4090, 5090 and 4080 and 5080. There's a massive gap there on the 50 series. So let's look at this table here. This gives us an idea about the maximum CUDA cores available on each die. Okay, so the current Blackwell GB202 die, which is for the 5090 at the moment, has a maximum of 24, just over 24,500 CUDA cores maximum. Now the RTX 5090 is using something over, just over 21,000. So it is in the region of 3,000 of headroom, basically. Could possibly be a 5090 Ti down the road, we'll see, or some kind of Titan. But we'll talk about that in a second. And you can look at things like the transistor density, and you can see between Blackwell and Ada Lovelace, there's very little difference across the board. It's all sort of 120-ish in terms of millions of transistors per square millimeter. Okay, and you can see, the maximum we have at the moment is a possibility of 92.2 billion transistors on a die. Okay, so those CUDA core counts will become important in a second when we discuss whether there could be potentially a 5080 Ti or a 5080 Super. Okay, that these core counts are important. When we look at those percentages in a bar chart, okay, just to kind of make a sort of, if I move out of the way here a little bit, you'll see the stark difference. So die size being pretty much similar across the board for the second tier of graphics cards. Sometimes it's 4080, 5080. With Ampere, the 80 class was actually on the top die. It was a cut down version of that. So it just goes to show that 80 class, whatever, they're just names. They don't align necessarily to core densities or chips or anything like that. It's just a marketing tool, really, that people identify with a certain class of cards. And we know there was an issue before with the 40 series, and now there's a massive issue on the 50 series. One that's frankly enraging a lot of people, that there isn't something in between, but we'll continue to talk about that as this video goes on. So it's very stark. You can see there, obviously, the light blue is roughly half the size in total, so they're split pretty much evenly there, and you can see there's less of a difference on the other generations. Now this is important, going back to this chart up here, okay? In relation to the maximum possible number of CUDA cores on a die. If we look at this chart now, this is showing the percentage of the maximum potential cores are being used by a particular GPU. Okay, so it's basically the actual core counts on a card versus the maximum possible that could have been on the die. Okay, so we can see here that the 5080 is using up 100% of the available die space, okay, the available cores. It means that it couldn't have more cores without being on a different chip, whether that's GB202 or a GB203 dash something or other, dash A, dash 1, whatever it is, or 400 or whatever the names they come up with. We can see that for Ada Lovelace, with the launch of the much maligned launch of the 4080, particularly in terms of price to performance, we can see that used up 95% of the potential maximum number of cores available. And that allowed 5% headroom for a super variant. So we know that based on benchmarks, despite the fact that the 4080 Super maxed out the die, it had basically 5 to 6% extra cores, depending on how you calculate it, but we weren't getting 5 to 6% extra performance typically. It was usually 2, maybe 3%. So it just goes to show that more cores doesn't necessarily scale, because there are other limiting factors to do with power and frequency and all kinds of things. It's its ability to maintain those extra cores and to keep the clocks up consistently, for example. We can see that with the Ampere generation, none of the 80 class cards fully maxed out, but it did come from way back on 81% to a little bit of an upgrade plus extra VRAM, and this will be important because this is a good comparison to what could potentially happen with a 5080 Super. And there was room there for a very significant bump up with the TI model. And we know the TI was getting very close to the 3090. Okay, so that's important context, I think. The main takeaway is that the 5080 maxes out GB202, whereas the 4080 Super had 5% of the cores left to play with. Now, as far as I see it, I see there being 3 options for 5080 Super or TI. RTI Super, of course. We know what NVIDIA introduced in the last year or so. So let's look at these 3 options now, because I think 2 of them are possibles, and I think 1 of them is unlikely. So possibility number 1, an entirely new die in between GB202 and GB203. It could be a GB203A, GB203-400 or -600 or whatever designation they want to give it. But I think that's unlikely for several reasons, which we'll come on to. The second option is a cut down version of GB202. And we've seen this before. We've seen where a top tier die has maybe a more ambitious number of CUDA cores on a card, and maybe on a particular die it's tested and there are some cores that fail or don't come up to standards, so they have to reduce the number of cores. And they don't just reduce the number of cores that aren't working, they usually tie a card to a certain number of cores, and then they disable all of the cores down to that level. Even if there are cores that are working, they just disable them anyway, just to have a consistent number of cores across a single product. So the cut down version of GB202 will depend on product positioning and the core failure rates, basically. Are Are there a lot of cores failing? Are there only a small number of cores failing and it just fails slightly to reach 5090 standards? Okay, this will depend, and it's very difficult for me to even guess what that might be without any insider knowledge. So it's just difficult to tell. The third option is basically to make the best of GB203. It's there, it exists, it can be tinkered with. There's a little bit of headroom that we'll talk about shortly, but not much, to be fair. Let's look at option one. I think there's several factors against it. Obviously, additional cost. There's time. Okay, if I'm assuming there's nothing that exists at the moment. I don't know if there's anything potentially in development. And you know, there may be, because there's no competition from AMD at this tier, you know, from 80 class up, there isn't any realistic competition. So there may not be the willingness, the need to develop an entirely new die. So, you know, you can imagine a new die with, if I work it out, I'd be working out in my head, but something in the region of, I don't know, 384-bit bus or something like that. Something in between 256 and 512, whatever is halfway in between would be your potential bus width for that, and would give you a natural 24 gigabytes, I think. So the other factor, of course, is that it's a very unpredictable world now. There's a lot of stuff going on in terms of trade, tariffs, and so on. Trump has come into office and started, well, he's a bit like a bull in a china shop. It's tariffs here, it's cuts here, there's all sorts of stuff going on. Some people are doomsayers about it. Some people think, you know, it'll just resolve itself over time. I'm not going to offer too much of an opinion on that, other than to say it's unpredictable. It could go either way. It could affect supply from different countries, which could make a company like NVIDIA risk averse. They're not going to necessarily introduce too many new things in an unpredictable world. So they're going to stick to what they have, refine what they have, and find other ways to innovate or sell you things that you want to buy, basically. Let's look at option two. And obviously this idea of selling a cut down chip is quite common. So for example, when NVIDIA ran into supply issues with the 3060 Ti, which was obviously a very successful card for them, you know, it had the price to performance ratio very much spot on. They repurposed the larger GA103. So they had a GA104 already being used with it. They had supply issues, so then they started using the GA103, which was designated for, you know, basically 3080 laptops, for example, that had many more cores in them, even though they're all, you know, it's power limited, they're much reduced in terms of frequency and so on, but still a lot more cores. So they can do it when they need to. The question is, of course, do they need to? So larger dies with defects get repurposed for new cut-down products or existing lower-end products. So the example of existing being the 3060 Ti. Would there be a 5080 Super or Ti with a new with cut-down? With a cut-down version of GB202? Hard to say. Okay, we'll come back to this in a second and try to guess what might happen. There, as I said, there is still headroom on with the 5090 on GB202. There is a little bit of room for a 5090 Ti. And you could look at where the 5090 is currently limited, whether it's bandwidth or power, whatever it is, and look at a 5090 Ti as addressing that. So, as I said, there's almost 3,000 cores still available. That's you know, another, you know, that's 1/8 nearly, or just over 1/8 of the entire die is still available. Now, whether they can realistically and in quantity fill up a lot of those and be able to produce a lot of them without failure, I don't know. I don't know what kind of wastage there is, how many of them fail, but there is at least some headroom for a 5090 Ti or a Titan product. So, you know, what's a 5090 Ti going to look like? Potentially 48 gigabytes, who knows, even 64. But then you're talking about power, big an issue. You're starting to think about maybe downclocking even more. And you're looking at potentially two 16-pin PCI ports to possibly support, depending on how they're rated. If they're both rated at 600 watts each, then obviously that's 1200 watts, which is crazy. American power outlets can't even really support that much. They can barely, but it's difficult, so you can't really get those power supplies. You can get 1600 watts and maybe more, but you're really pushing it. So maybe they can go up to 700-800 watts maybe, but it's probably still requiring two cables. So with this option 2, you could have 24 gigabytes. Okay, you can get there with 3 gigabyte DDR7 modules. Now you could, in theory, have anything between 20 and 32 gigabytes, depending on bus width and so on. You could have a combination of 2 or 3 gigabyte GDDR7 modules to make pretty much any combination. But as I'll discuss in a second, it's not really realistic to go mixing and matching 2 and 3 gigabyte modules on the same card. There can be issues of latency when one memory controller is handling more memory than another one. So if one is handling 2 gigabytes and it's a little bit faster than one handling 3 gigabytes, because there's obviously more address space, then the timings can be a little bit off. You can introduce a little bit of latency, and who knows what kind of effects that could have. You could have micro stuttering, frame pacing issues and so on. You just don't know. So it could be a lot of work for them to try and tune something like that. And then option 3 is probably the most realistic option of all. It's the simplest option. It's the one they've already done with the 4080 Super. So this would be an improved GB203. Now, the thing to remember with GB203 is that, let's look back to AD103. They had 5% extra to play with, so they could easily go to a 4080 Super. Also, we know that they're very similar generations. There's not really a lot of improvement with the 5080 versus the 4080 or 4080 Super. So we know that they've probably spent 2 years refining that as best as they can. So in a year, are they going to be able to make any significant improvements in the architecture to get maybe improved latency somewhere in the pipeline? Who knows? It seems unlikely to me, but you don't know. So as I showed on the previous chart, if we go back here, there is no headroom on GB203. They've used it all up basically. So what can they do? Well, I have a question, and I don't think it's that controversial, you know, it's not tinfoil hat stuff or anything. I think it's making a reasonable assumption maybe based on the evidence that's at hand. So the question is NVIDIA sandbagging their 5080 Founders Edition model? Okay, that's my question. This is TechPowerUp's review of 10 partner models, okay, AIB models, from the likes of ASUS, Zotac, Colorful, Gainward Palette, Gigabyte, MSI, Galax. Okay, a good selection across the board. You see down the bottom here, and I'll give all of these in the description as usual, and you can type these in as well. So the reference is here. So this is TechPowerUp. Their test, okay, they've put the Founders Edition at 100%, and though there's a little bit of variation, you can see that typically we're talking maybe an average of 4 or 5% better, up to 6% for the ROG Astral. Okay, now I have this on order, the ROG Astral, so we will put this to the test. I'll make some interesting content where I overclock the hell out of it, as much as I can get out of it, to see can I push it to at least the stock performance of a 4090. Okay, we'll see. Can I get, I'm optimistic I might get to 95% of a stock 4090 when I really push the ROG Astral to its limit. Okay, so I'm hoping to get that soon. It hasn't been shipped yet. Obviously not that long since I ordered it. We've got the weekend, and I'm not sure if they had it in the warehouse when I actually ordered it. I was allowed to order it, but it may be slightly on backlog, so there might be a bit of a delay. I'm not sure. But as soon as I have it, I will start making some interesting content and really push it to the maximum to see what's possible. But the reason that's relevant is, you know, you've got 4, 5, 6% typically. Obviously, the ROG Astral is top of the range. It's got the best cooler. You can push it a little bit further, but still, there is some headroom there. Now, when you think about it, the Founders Edition cards typically are reviewed a day before, and they set the trend basically. So when you look up TechPowerUp and their database, okay, so it's widely used to compare graphics cards and their power at usually 4K for modern cards, then it's the Founders Edition that sets that percentage. And when NVIDIA produced their own charts, like they did at the launch of the 50 series, they were referring back to their own Founders Edition model. So if they've left 3, 4, 5, 6% on the table by being less aggressive with their clock speeds and so on, then it's very easy for them to just be a little bit more aggressive with a supermodel. So think about the 4080 Super, 5% extra cores, 2 to 3% extra performance. They can get that extra performance without the core count increase if they have sandbagged the 5080, if they've held a little back. And the partners haven't held as much back, but it's still possible they held a little bit back because the cards, as we see here, they're overclocking very well by NVIDIA standards. Recently, if you overclocked, maybe you could get 5% extra. Typically, you'd get 3 to 5%, depending on what card you had, the cooler, the quality of the components in it, the MOSFETs and so on. And you'd be lucky to kind of get maybe 3000 megahertz. But it seems to be fairly easy to overclock Blackwell to 32 to 3300 megahertz, okay, which brings it up to 10% higher in terms of clock speeds than Ada Lovelace. So what this typically yields is an extra 8 to 10 or 11% performance or frames per second, if you want to talk about real world scenarios, above the Founders Edition model at stock settings. So there's quite a lot of headroom, definitely, for a Super Series 5080 without even increasing core counts. So here's some references here. JayzTwoCents. Here we see it running comfortably at 3255. Okay, that's plus 500 megahertz, and a more conservative plus 500 megahertz on the memory clock. Here's Frame Chasers getting similar results, plus 475, so slightly less aggressive on the core clock, but more aggressive on the memory clock. And keeping the temperatures under control. As you can see here, this is only 53 degrees. And Hardware Unboxed, again another reference here. This is just one example. Similar approach with an MSI Vanguard edition. In Dying Light 2, very significant increase over the standard. Okay, so it's in this case just over 10% of an improvement. Very significant. And you can see without even overclocking it, you could see there was about a 4% difference. So there is scope to increase core clocks and boost clocks above the 5080 standard edition. You can also add 3GB GDDR7 chips when they're available to bring it up to 24 gigabytes of VRAM on it, which for a lot of people, the 16 gigabyte limit is what's stopping them going for 5080 and making them wait. It would be the thing that tips it for a lot of people. It would tip it over the edge to actually purchase a 5080, would be if it was a 5080 Super with 28 gigabytes of VRAM. But as I've noted, world markets and international trade is predictable now since Trump took office. So we can't bank on anything. You could say, okay, I'm going to wait a year for 3 gigabyte modules, and they don't arrive. Or they arrive in small quantities, or they're very expensive. So we just don't know how this is going to play out. It feeds into the question, do I wait or do I buy now? And the important factors to consider in that kind of a decision, NVIDIA has basically close to zero competition at 5080 plus level. The 9070 XT from AMD looks promising. The leaks are very promising. Some of the results in leaked benchmarks get close to the old 4080, but that's only in some benchmarks, and it'll be a little bit short of that. So it'll probably typically be more like a 4070 Ti, maybe a 4070 Ti Super with ray tracing results. I would estimate around 4070 levels in standard RT. I think in path tracing, even though it's the 9070 XT is getting up to the levels of the 7900 XTX in terms of ray tracing, the 7900 XTX is still miles behind the 40 series in terms of path tracing. So if path tracing is your thing, then the 9070 XT still might not be very viable. But it's certainly an exciting prospect to have something coming from AMD that really challenges that 70 tier class, and hopefully the pricing will match that excitement. So NVIDIA do not have to release anything new. If it doesn't suit them, they won't. If they don't see the need, if they see risk in it, if they don't see the extra money in it, then they won't do it. It's as simple as that. And you have to factor in as well that they've already publicly stated that it's getting more and more difficult to get real hardware improvements, that their focus is now moving as much to software as hardware. That tells us maybe that the 60 series isn't going to be the massive jump forward that we expect. Again, will geopolitical issues push it back, the 60 series? Will there be issues that prevent us moving to 3 or 2 nanometer or whatever the next node is going to be? We just don't know. It's a bit unpredictable. So that's why I am thinking maybe you just work with what you do know. Okay, and what we do know is the unfortunate situation we see ourselves in at the moment. So if you were to make a 5080 Ti that was potentially going to compete with a 6080, then why would you buy a 6080 when maybe there's a 5080 Ti that could potentially have more VRAM? Okay, so that's tricky for NVIDIA, and do they go for 24 gigabytes at all if it impacts their ability to basically launch a 6080 series successfully? Another factor is they do not have to reduce any prices, and they could go up. Okay, there are some analysts who say that because of these new tariffs, we're going to see inflation. If prices go up 10%, and I imagine graphics cards are going to go up 10%. So there's absolutely no guarantee that a 5080 Super, for example, is just going to be 1,000 again, or that they're going to reduce the price of the standard 5080 to like 900 or 850 or something. There's absolutely no guarantee of that, and there's no reason for them to do it if people keep buying. So if sales do tail off after the initial hype, there has been a lot of hype despite some negative reviews, people are still clamoring to get them. And maybe if NVIDIA need to reinvigorate sales like they did with the 4080 didn't sell particularly well, and they introduced the 4080 Super to boost sales at that class of card. So option 2, the cut down die, that would mean a 5080 Ti, I think. The exact positioning between 5080 and 5090 is unknown. There's no real way of telling that. NVIDIA must protect their Halo product positioning. And as I said already, they have to think about their 60 series launch, which will only be possibly a year or so after the Super series, the 50 Super series launch. So you have to think about that as well. So strategically, they might gimp or cut down GB202 a bit more than they need to, just to keep that positioning so it's not too far above the 5080. And if we look at option 3, which would mean a 5080 Super, now both of options 2 and 3 could happen. Okay, there could be a 5080 Ti and there could be a 5080 Super. So it would be similar to the 4080 Super in performance, maybe 3 to 5% better, based on my estimations of how much they're sandbagging by. And I think we're unlikely to see a price cut like the 4080 Super had. Okay, so 4080 Super was 1,000, the 4080 was 1,200. At the moment, the 5080 is 1,000. Where is the impetus? Where is the motivation for NVIDIA to reduce prices without any competition? The 9070 XT, I think it's going to be too far below. I think it's a tier below the 5080 and 5080 potential Super product, and so I think that's just a bit too low to put pressure to reduce prices. I do think it is likely to have 24 gigabytes of VRAM, otherwise why would they bother selling it? But because I don't see much pressure on the 5080, the standard edition, being cut in price, then it makes me think that pricing could be something like $1,200–1,300, so that it's positioned somewhere in between the 5080 and the 4090. It might reach the same level of performance as a 4090 with the same level of VRAM. Whether they would compare exactly performance-wise in all aspects, including creative and AI and so on, I'm not sure, but I think they would be fairly comparable. But because the 4090, of course, was priced at $1,600, then all they have to do is price it just a bit below that and call it a day, and claim really good price to performance and so on with the extra, particularly with the extra 24 gigabytes of VRAM. And sure, they can throw in a few fake frames or fake something else. They'll always be able to make something up, some new technology that they launch that happens to require a little piece of new hardware architecture that only runs very well on this and runs slower on other previous architectures. But who knows? I mean, who knows the way these guys work? So yeah, I don't think we're going to see a 20 gigabyte model, for example, on the same GB203, because of that asymmetry between 2 and 3 gigabyte memory controllers. The asymmetry is not what you want. You want to keep things symmetrical. Otherwise, you might have latency as one thing is waiting for something else, and it could introduce things like microstutter, or who knows what kind of effect it would have. Now, there is precedent for that. Going back to 2012, there was a 3 gigabyte 660 Ti with a mix of 1 gigabyte and half gigabyte modules to make a 3 gigabyte one, but that introduced those kind of issues I've just talked about. So that's basically it. Those are my thoughts. Do you wait or not is the question. And you have to ask questions like, what is your need right now? Do I need an 80 class card in the current generation? You have to look at various factors, obviously the second-hand market. If you're on an 8 to 12 gigabyte card and you want to move to 4K, you've got a nice 4K TV, or you've got yourself a new monitor, you'll very quickly find out that 8 to 12 gigabytes is not enough. So you might have a need to get something with more VRAM, and you might want good ray tracing or path tracing performance, in which case you might say, okay, Maybe I can get a second-hand 4080 Super or 4080, or maybe I'll just buy a 5080 now. I have a need. I want to enjoy 4K gaming for the next year. I don't want to wait. Okay, that has to be factored in. So if you think about FOMO, think about going back to game design theory and Heisenberg's magic circle. When you're playing games, you're in the magic circle. Okay, you've blocked the world out. When you're enjoying that game, are you micro-analyzing that game? Are you thinking, if I had another 4 gigabytes of VRAM, I'm assuming you've already tuned it to work with the VRAM you have, and the graphics are okay looking. Are you really missing out that much? So, or is there only outside that magic circle of gaming that you're starting to fret about things when you start getting onto YouTube and other social media, forums and so on, and you see all this kind of, people baiting people about NVIDIA versus AMD and all that kind of stuff, and then do you start thinking, oh, I'm missing out on something here, when you're not really missing out that much. So if you do need one, buy one. There is no guaranteed future about Super or TI models coming out. You don't know what the pricing is going to be. You don't know what the availability is going to be like. If you do wait a year, you're going to miss out on a year of gaming at another level. Okay, you're going to miss out on 4K gaming, for example. If you're worried about 16 gigabytes of VRAM, and it is a legitimate concern, and I don't blame people for having that concern, but as someone who's managed up to recently with 12 gigabytes and been able to play most games at 4K, and now I have a 4080 Super with a 5080. Okay, I've got two main PCs that I maintain. The 4080 Super with 16 gigabytes of RAM. I've played a few games, and I can tell you honestly, I've only once gone over the 16 gigabytes and had it affect performance. And that was Indiana Jones with supreme or very high texture pool settings, which are ridiculous because you don't even notice the difference between high and supreme. Okay, I think the supreme is there to allow 24 and 32 gigabyte cards take advantage of the VRAM they have. They're not designed for people with 16 gigabytes. That they have a setting for you if you've got 16 gigabytes. So I personally don't see 16 gigabytes as an issue for the next 2, 3, or maybe even more years. I think it's going to be absolutely fine. So I wouldn't necessarily let that hold you off. I mean, that there's this holy grail of 24 gigabytes and suddenly so many more games are going to be available at high settings. That's not going to be the case. There's only so much you can do with a 5080 anyway. So a lot of native 4K with path tracing is not available natively on a 5080 anyway. So you're going to be using upscaling, and that's going to cut back the VRAM usage. Plus NVIDIA, as more AAA games come out and start using NVIDIA technologies to do with DLSS4 and neural shaders and all that kind of stuff, then it might reduce VRAM requirements by half gigabyte or a gigabyte or whatever it is. It wouldn't make that much difference, but it might help. So if you do have income to spare, there are no terrible choices. If you get a 5080 look, it's disappointing compared to the 4080 Super, but on its own merits, it's still a great card. It gives you fantastic 4K experience. So look, there you have it. Do I buy now or wait? Wait for what? You don't know what you're waiting for. Buy now. It's disappointing. Could have been more. Should have been given more by NVIDIA, but it is what it is. If you have the money to spare, great. Why not buy it? Unless you want to make a statement. Okay, I hear this a lot. I'm not going to buy it because NVIDIA this or that. Great, if you want to do that, I absolutely admire that. But I wouldn't blame anyone for having a need right now. They've got a new 4K OLED TV, 65 plus inches, and they want to fill it up with all the eye candy. I'm not going to blame you if you get a 5080. So anyway, look, this has been a long analysis. I think I've given you all the numbers to help you make your decision. Let me know in the comments what you think. Would you buy now? Would you wait? Do you have a kind of a prediction for what's coming? Good luck to you if you do. I think I'd love to employ you if you do, because you'd make me a lot of money if you could predict the future based on what's happening right now. We could make a lot of money together. So get down in the comments with all your ideas for how to make money out of that. And do please subscribe. Support the channel. It's new. I'm trying to build it up. I want to get to those 1,000 subscribers. I want to monetize the channel so I can plow that money back into the channel with loads of new equipment, lots of fancy reviews. And with that, after 3/4 of an hour, it's definitely time to finish. And I'll see you in the next video.